last video, we were looking at the news sheet that Mueller Brass was putting out, and at the time they didn't know what the name would be, and so they asked for suggestions. What shall we name it? And I found out the answer to this question thanks to Dave Crocker, because he submitted this photograph here that you're looking at now, and it was called the Mueller News. I thought it might be something a little bit more original, but I guess that explains the paper pretty well. As we look down in this complex and zoom in to where the Mueller office building was, this isn't where it was originally when Mueller's was first built here. The office was on Military Street, almost directly across from the Mueller plant in Sarnia. So I have to think this was a carryover because Oscar Mueller lived in Port Huron while he was running Mueller Company in Sarnia, and this would have been probably the office that he worked out of, and made sense to use while they were building the Mueller Brass plant in Port Huron. And as we scroll down here, you can see in the bottom right hand corner the caption that says General Office. It was almost impossible back in the heyday when Mueller Brass was going very strong that you couldn't talk to a friend or neighbor or relative without finding out they worked for Mueller Brass. My father worked for Mueller Brass for over 25 years. My mother worked during the war for a short period of time. My aunt and uncle worked there, and my other uncle worked there. Matter of fact, that particular uncle got hurt during one of the strikes that Mueller Brass had. The photo you're looking at now, I believe, was a strike that was in 1937. When Muellers went on strike, it didn't hurt only the employees, it hurt the economy of the city of Port Huron as well. Because they were hurting as far as what they could buy and what they couldn't buy. I know my father had 3 part-time jobs when they were out on strike at one time, so it wasn't easy for them. One of the things I remember as a boy taking my father to work is that there was basically 2 different ways we could get there depending on which way we were coming from. He always entered the east gate because that was the closest to the brass shop is where he worked. And you can see from the Sanborn map, the red line would represent Francis Street, which is the way that we usually went because we came across the 10th Street Bridge. But if you're coming down Lapeer, you could also go along where that blue line is between Allenbrook and the Mueller offices. There was a road there as well. I also remember being able to get gas here because Mueller's had their own gas station. It was almost right there on the corner where the red line and the blue line meet. And if you kind of stand on your head a little bit, you can see the word filling station. And I believe the gas was taken out of their paycheck because I don't ever remember my dad paying for it. And that was before credit cards. In this aerial view, where that red arrow is where the gas station was as well. In that same map, we can see the brass shop just across the way from the filling station. And on the south end of the brass shop, we can see the fire department. I don't know if that's always where the fire department was, but in this map in the 40s, that's what it says. But it does give me an opening to show you these pictures of the Mueller Brass Fire Department, or at least some of their vehicles. Not quite what I was expecting, but it looks like they did the job just fine. And almost anyone in the Mueller Brass family had one of these, a little anvil. And usually they're given out at open houses or just given to the employees to take home with them. Here are the pins that Mueller awarded for years of service, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 that you don't see here, but my dad had a 25-year pin. Mueller Brass was also very involved in the community. They always had a float in every major parade that Port Huron had. And this one here, this was for a Lights Golden Jubilee in 1929. And we're very fortunate to have this picture, and some of you might have a hint of where this float was seeking shelter. Because of the rounded top, you may have guessed where it was. But this is the building right here, the old Goodyear store. After the war, the Mueller family invested about $2 million for the plant to be converted to manufacturing other metal-based, primarily brass, products instead of munitions. This plant did very well, and Oscar Mueller liked Port Huron enough to commit to it entirely. When he transferred his interest in the Mueller Company for the parent firm's interest in Mueller Brass Company, thereby becoming the sole owner of Mueller Brass. Here are a couple more recent photographs that Dave Crocker sent to me, taken about 1971, I believe. Dave was a former employee at Mueller Brass. This was the rod shipping warehouse. Everything the rod mill produced went through rod shipping. In every manufacturing plant, there's an element of danger. And in this building, Dave tells us what it is. He writes this: "The stacker crane that you see me operating was made a remote cable-operated crane after I left because nobody wanted to be exposed to the dangers of going in and out of those aisles. That crane would occasionally catch as it was traveling down the aisles and spill thousands of pounds of brass rod in every direction." And he goes on to tell a little bit about what transpired in that building, and you can read this at your leisure. As we zoom in on this photograph here, we can see Dave operating this stacker crane. One of Mueller Brass's innovative designs was the streamline fitting. I don't think there's any of us here that hasn't seen these fittings in our homes. Especially if you have a basement, you can see it quite easily. He also developed a hot process in forging brass fittings for electrical refrigeration that was used in pipes and couplings that would not leak. For this purpose, only forged parts would be secure. An official Frigidaire company described Mueller's as the greatest factor in the success of its refrigerators. It would seem that Oscar Mueller was a very fortunate man. Fortunate in the respect that he was now the sole owner of Mueller Brass Company, and also the fact that he had a wonderful family. Of course, he had his wife Beatrice, and he had two beautiful children. Florence, which you see on the left, and Bernhard, which you see on the right. I believe Mr. Mueller was a good family man as well. Here we see a picture of him on the beach. They really seem to like the beach. I have a couple different pictures of them on the beach, but here's one that has his family in it, and one other person that I really can't identify. Here's one of him and his wife walking on the beach. And here's another beach photo with Mr. and Mrs. Mueller in the center there. I also believe they like to travel. In this photograph here, you can see them with friends. That's Mr. and Mrs. Mueller on the right. And it seems to be aboard an excursion steamer. Here, the Muellers are aboard a train. And as we zoom in on them, you can see that this train is heading for Mount Washington. And as we scan over here to the right, you can see the Mueller family, Mr. and Mrs. Mueller in the back, and it looks like Florence is I thought maybe it was sitting on the lap, but it looks like they're both sitting in the seat ahead of him, and that's Bernhard beside her. Florence is shown here as a child, but she would grow up to be a beautiful young lady. And Bernhard, he grew up to be a very handsome young man. However, both these children would cause the Muellers the greatest heartache. But we'll get to that in just a moment. The information I'm about to share with you now came from this wonderful article by Vicki Priest entitled "The Tragedies That Caused Oscar Mueller, a Man Among Men, to Leave Port Huron." The Muellers had lived in the 1100 block of Pine Grove Avenue. And in the 1920s, about the mid-1920s, they built a new home far up on Water Street, which would now be called Strawberry Lane. The 100-acre estate came to be called Waldheim. It was filled with an extensive orchard and vegetable and flower gardens, all of which were watered with a sprinkler system. I tried hard to find a photograph of this home, but I couldn't. However, I did find this Christmas greeting, which, lo and behold, has a picture of not only his home in Port Huron, but his home in Florida as well. The pine, of course, in the greetings would refer to his northern home in Port Huron. And the poem in this greeting would refer, of course, to his winter home in Florida. All right, let's zoom in here on the entrance of Waldheim and take a look at it. These pictures aren't real clear because I have to blow them up, but it gives you some idea. A rustic gateway to Waldheim. And as we scan down, we can see Waldheim. Let's see what the caption says here. Waldheim, home in the woods. This bungalow, nestling among the trees in this temporary northern home of Mr. and Mrs. O.B. Mueller, near Port Huron, Michigan. All right, since we're here, let's look at his Florida home as well. We'll just scan around so you can get some idea of what it was like. Very nice indeed. The Mueller Country Club was announced in 1924 and all was up and running by 1926. This recreation area was made for his employees but still exists, in part at least, as the Black River Country Club. Oscar Mueller was highly regarded by all, even his employees, whom he took great interest in. He felt a responsibility for his employees, was among them all the time, and even looked into their welfare indirectly. One fellow recalled Oscar calling him into his office and asking about his family and financial situation, which surprised him since he didn't know how Mueller knew about his problems. Upon finding out the nature of the problems and the amount of debt the employee was in, Oscar wrote the man a check for $2,000 to cover it all. So things seemed good for Oscar and his family. He had obviously made plans to stay in Port Huron, and the fruition of his plans, the acquisition of Mueller Company plant here, came to pass. He liked it here, and people liked him. But then tragedy struck the family. In the same year he gained sole control of Mueller Brass. His daughter Florence, who had just gotten married in June of that year at the Waldheim estate, was killed in an automobile accident in Seattle, Washington. She had married John Hamilton Irving, who lived there, and it was in August of 1927 that the car they were passengers in crashed. She was the only person to die. According to one article, Florence had earlier suffered from a strange sleeping sickness that struck people starting in 1916 and afflicted Americans into the 1920s. Many died from the strange ailment, and if they didn't die, they usually never fully recovered. So it must have been with a great deal of relief and gladness that Florence had finally recovered after a year's time. Yet she was taken from her loved ones while still very young. One of Oscar's brothers, Philip, also died that year, and another, Frederick, died the next in 1928. Time passed, and Oscar's son Bernhard, known as Bud, learned his dad's trade and became vice president of Mueller Brass. His personal life appears to have some ups and downs, as he married Mamie McQueen in 1923. After apparently divorcing, married her again in New York in 1931. They never had any children, and while reference to Mamie could still be found in papers, Bernhard married Alberta F. Chartier in February of 1934. They had a boy, Frederick, in the spring of 1935, but then tragedy struck the Mueller family again. Bernhard wanted to have some fun with his new car and with his friends, which ended up costing him his life, as well as the life of one of those friends. While taking a drive with three others in his car, Bernhard swerved to miss hitting a dog, but the swerve led to a plunge. Gordon Godley, husband and father, was killed instantly, and Bernhard was seriously injured. The two others were much less injured in the May 18, 1935 accident. Bernhard succumbed to his injuries and died the 25th of May. Reading testimony presented in probate court, one wonders if fate was trying to take a holiday and Bernhard just wasn't listening. The following is not meant to demean Bernhard, but to wonder at events seen in hindsight. When he and his friends had left the Blackwater Country Club that evening, Bernhard was very insistent that they go with him for a drive in his new car, which was at his house. They didn't want to go, but he was insistent. When he arrived at his house, he argued with his wife. He also realized he left his new car keys at the clubhouse. He wanted to take the drive so badly that he wouldn't take no for an answer from his friends. He appears to have disregarded his wife's interest. He drove all the way back to the clubhouse to get his keys and was driving dangerously fast at the time of the crash. The odometer read 92 miles per hour after the crash. The last thing Bernhard said in the car was in response to his friends commenting on the speed he was driving. So enduring what no parent should have to, the death of all one's children before oneself, Oscar decided to retire and leave behind all he had done here. Considering how he had developed his estate, Oscar no doubt planned on spending his retirement years here, watching his son run the company he had built. But that all changed after the arrangements to transfer the company were made in 1935. He sold his interest in it and retired the following summer. He and his wife had a summer home in Florida, and that's where they moved to permanently. Oscar died in Bradenton, Florida in 1941, and Beatrice followed him some years later in 1952. Back in Port Huron, the Waldheim estate, described as one of the most beautiful sites on the Black River, began to be subdivided in 1940. After Mr. Mueller left Port Huron, Freddie Jr. became president of Mueller Brass. And this article here that we'll end our video with, it's a very interesting article. You can't read every word because it's not a scanned copy, it's a photograph, but certainly enough there that you can enjoy the article. And he goes back and talks about how his dad started with Oscar Mueller at Sarnia and then Port Huron. And some of the stories that went on in between. So I'll let you read this at your leisure. Today, Mueller Brass still has a presence in Port Huron, but it's only a shadow of what it used to be back in its glory days. Join me in my next video and we'll look at what was there before Mueller Brass, and that was the Cass Motor Company that produced trucks.